Something many thought would never happen has finally happened. Donald Trump is the 45th President of the United States. An UpFront special. The outgoing President of the United States, Barack Obama, called his successor, the new President Donald Trump, uniquely unqualified for the job of Commander-in-Chief. How much damage might President Trump do, both at home and abroad? The week he was elected back in November, I sat down with a panel of experts: journalist and activist Naomi Wolf, academic and author Hamid Dabashi, former State Department and Goldman Sachs official Robert Hormats, and Trump biographer and journalist David K. Johnston. I began by asking David K. Johnston how big a shock Trump's win was to him.
Well, I always said he might win. And in fact, the fact is that he has, and he is going to be the president, and hopefully we're going to have peaceful transition. I don't think this is going to go well for the country, and I hope that this turns into lemonade instead of lemons for America, and people recognize how important it is to pay as much attention to politics as many people do to the last scrimmage in a football game.
Naomi Wolf, what was your reaction when you saw the results late on Tuesday night?
I mean, I wish I could say that I was surprised. I'm extremely troubled and frightened as an American, as someone who cares about democracy, and especially as someone who's been warning since 2009 that we've seen every signs progressively of losing critical aspects of our democracy. One of the things as a journalist that I feel personally exposed about is that, you know, this is a guy who has made no secret of his antagonism to journalists, and we have something called Clause 1021 in a bill that was passed in 2012 that allows this guy to hold any American indefinitely without charge or trial. That was a theoretical concern when I was screaming and yelling about it in 2012, 2013. It is a real fear for me right now.
Yes, all those, all those executive powers that liberal Barack Obama amassed are now available to conservative populist Donald Trump. Hamid Dabashi, put this in some historical perspective for us. When you look at the assassination of JFK, the attack on Pearl Harbor, 9/11, where does this fit in kind of major traumatic American political events?
I just came from New York. I can tell you chapter and verse. Since 9/11, I had not seen New York so frightened. On Columbia campus, NYU campus, the city, public schools, etc. It has a historical perspective. I wouldn't go as far back as Pearl Harbor, but there is something in the history of the crescendo of the rising of the right in the United States that at least has to be traced back to Reaganomics, and after that the new conservative takeover, after that the rise of the Tea Party, and now with this prospect of fascism. That's the trajectory that needs to be kept in mind.
Bob Hormats, you served in the Obama administration, you served under Hillary Clinton, you're a Democrat. How much of a disaster is this for Americans who call themselves Democrats, liberals, progressives, who say they're on the left?
Well, it was certainly a shock, and certainly most people in the Democratic Party didn't anticipate anything like this, and particularly the kind of states in which he won, like Wisconsin and others. Most people thought they weren't in play at all, and Democrats would do very well. But it is shocking, and the real question before us now is, does he govern the way he ran for the presidency? Does he take the same kind of views as president that he did when he was running?
David K. Johnston, you've studied the man up close and personally for 28 years. Can he change?
No, Donald's a 70-year-old man. I'm 67. I'm not going to change, and neither is Donald. What you're seeing in this election is not the home of the free and the brave, but the rise of fear and authoritarianism. And I think we need to be very concerned about that. And Naomi's quite right. I'm not going to continue doing what I'm doing, but I recognize totally that Donald could have me swept off the streets once he becomes president and held incommunicado. It's important for people to remember two things. The privilege of habeas corpus in the Constitution is a privilege. It is not a right, and the president can suspend it in times of insurrection. So we should not have any violence whatsoever, no matter how much individual acts of violence are committed by racists and bigots. There should be no violence in response, because that will allow Trump to suspend habeas corpus, and I'm very concerned that he will, given the right opportunity, suspend the Constitution.
Okay, well, let me put this point to Hamid Dabashi, because a lot of people are warning about this. David's put it in a very eloquent and quite scary terms, I think most people would say. This idea that, you know, he could be an authoritarian president, he could abuse powers that exist, invent new powers, etc. And yet when you hear all that, why is it then that so many people stayed at home? So many people saw that there was no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. You were one of those who wrote that I see no difference between Clinton and Trump. They're just as bad as each other. In fact, you wrote Clinton is an infinitely more dangerous warmonger than all of the crackpot Republicans put together. Do you regret saying that?
No, I don't. Our legitimate criticism of Donald Trump should not be fed as regretting that Hillary Clinton is not. Hillary Clinton has her own warmongering, corporate connected, threatening nuclear annihilation of a whole country, etc., etc. Hillary Clinton was a known phenomenon, and Donald Trump is not a known phenomenon in terms of administration. One should not make this an ad hominem Donald Trump. Is the Congress, the Senate, and God forbid even the Supreme Court, it is a crescendo of institutions which are not under threat.
I want to put that point to Bob. Do you want to respond?
Well, first of all, I think to call Hillary Clinton a warmonger is ridiculous. I worked for her for 4 years. She's not a warmonger. And she's not comparing her with Donald Trump. She has a lot more experience. She has very good judgment on a wide range of issues. So I don't think that charge is accurate at all. I do think there are a lot of risks with Trump. First of all, I do think the point that he played to anger and fear is correct. He did. But he picked on a stream of thinking that has grown in the United States for the last several years. A lot of people feel disenfranchised. A lot of people feel that they have not benefited from prosperity, whereas Wall Street and a number of companies have. A lot of people feel that their problems are not being addressed in Washington. A lot of people feel that money really dominates the political process. Those are all legitimate concerns. The problem is, what are the answers? Do you appeal to anger, or do you try to find constructive answers to some of those concerns? I think Hillary aimed at that, and unfortunately, a lot of people's anger overcame the rational discourse that should have been in this campaign.
You know, there's a lot of talk about the left behind, neoliberalism, anti-establishment. I mean, if you look at Trump voters and the studies that have been done, they're not the poorest of the poor. And in fact, racial resentment is what a lot of experts say is driving them a lot more than income inequality. Hillary actually won more voters, according to the exit poll, amongst the poorest segments of America than Donald Trump did.
Right, but
are we ignoring the very real issue about racism, white insecurity, majority America?
You're mushing together respectfully class and race, and you're missing the nature of the grievance here in America. It is the middle class, and I've seen this in my own lifetime. You know, there used to be a middle class in America. There used to be people who could live together with the rich and the poor in cities because they could afford, you know, to be part of a community that was dense and urban. You know, there used to be a middle class that expected to send their kids to college, that expected their kids' lives to be better than their own lives. That's gone, and it's partly gone because of Mrs. Clinton and President Clinton. You know, again, respect them as politicians. NAFTA was the beginning of what these people felt, and they are not just feeling, but perceiving.
The studies show that the people who voted for Trump are not in areas that were hurt by free trade, are not in areas that were hurt by immigration. They are people who are much more driven by a black president.
They're middle class.
By whether Obama is Muslim. These are the stuff that ties together.
I think that, you know,
that's what the studies are showing.
His voters may show those people motivated by racism, but I'm certain, and because I've spoken to them and listened to them, it shows people who feel deeply disenfranchised.
Okay, how much does race play a role in this versus economics, Hamid?
In my opinion,
a lot.
You cannot. Race and class are two important issues. They're both important. Let's remember the dialectic of having these two candidates was playing into who voted for whom. I am absolutely convinced if the Democratic National Convention had not manhandled Bernie Sanders' primary as we know they did, and it was Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, we would have had a much different outcome.
You think Bernie would have won?
Absolutely, I'm convinced.
David K. Johnston, what is he going to do? Is there a danger that a lot of these people are angry, as Naomi's pointed out, disillusioned, have legitimate grievances, you put it, they vote for Trump, and you get a guy who's not going to do anything for them. His tax plan helps the 1% more than it helps any of them. What does that mean for the United States going forward? Does that just kick the anger down the road?
Well, we are in complete uncharted waters here. we don't know at all what's going to happen because Donald Trump has no political philosophy. He's not a fascist. He's not a conservative. He is a self-glorifier who believes he is genetically superior, and he has said that in the public record as one of his sons. So we are totally in uncharted territory here. I think the biggest concern, and I think we will have a constitutional crisis over this, is that he has the psyche of a 13-year-old boy in a 70-year-old man's body. And when the pressures come upon him as president about things he can't talk about, you're going to see it come out in some way. That's what I'm worried about, is that he is not emotionally stable.
You served in the State Department, Bob. Looking around the world today, what is the reaction of foreign governments, allies of the United States, to President Trump in January? And if you're an ally of the United States, how do you deal with this guy? What do you do? Do you cut your ties with America? Do you pretend he's not there, he's not the president? What do you do?
Well, this is one of the things that worries me. It's a good question. I think I was very disturbed at the way he dealt with allies in general during the campaign. Japan, South Korea, will let them have nuclear weapons and defend themselves. The kind of negative views he expressed about NATO, Mexico, one of our major partners. He has got to realize that one of the reasons that the United States for years has been able to play, I think, a constructive and certainly a substantial international leadership role is that we had strong alliances. I think his first goal on the international side should be to sit down with our NATO allies, sit down with the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of Korea, and underscore the fact that we want to reinvigorate our alliances, not let them deteriorate as some of his policies that he's advocated would do in the campaign.
Hamid, Bob's talking about allies, talking about quote-unquote enemies of the United States. Iran is a country you know well. What's the reaction to a Donald Trump president? What happens to U.S.-Iranian relations?
You have to put it, Mehdi, in the geopolitics of the region and the trouble spots. The trouble spots are Syria, where Iran is, where the Russia is, where the Turkey is, where the Saudis and the Qataris and everybody else is, and Iraq. Now, in Iraq, fortunately, ISIS is on the run. But where is ISIS is going to go? Probably to Central Asia, probably to North Africa. So it is not just a question of the unknown factor, and I do agree that Donald Trump's policies is unknown. We don't know which way he's going to go. But the fact of the very troubled region, all the way from Syria down to Yemen, how is he going to redefine his relationship with masses of billions of dollars of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia at the head of an 11-nation coalition bombing Yemen? If you go from North Africa to Yemen to Syria, there are really volatile situations.
And he wants to tear up the Iran nuclear deal, which is probably President Obama's biggest foreign affairs legacy.
And having lost its share of benefits in the aftermath of Libya, Russia has now entrenched itself in Syria with the alliance with Iran, and it is a very dangerous and volatile situation. And certainly he's not.
David K. Johnston, very briefly on Trump and Russia. You've written a great deal.
We do not know the full nature of the relationship between Donald Trump and Putin, but people should recognize that there are heavy financial relationships there, and more importantly, the way Donald Trump talks about Putin is the same way that mob soldiers who don't know they're being tape recorded by the FBI talk about the head of their mobs. So I suspect there is some deep relationship going on with the oligarchs and Trump that we don't know about. It may well trace to this violent felon, Felix Sater, who's very closely involved with Trump and his business dealings.
David K., thank you. Naomi, what do you think the world is thinking this week when they see Donald Trump is going to ascend to the office of JFK and Abraham Lincoln and FDR? He's going to be the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the history of the world.
Right. I mean, our brand was being tarnished, I think, in the last 15 years. But this is definitely a new, terrifying message for many people around the world. And 1 in 4 people on the planet is Muslim. And this is a candidate. I'm Jewish, and I've said online, yesterday, Muslims are the new Jews. Like, it feels like 1933 in America to me, in that this stream of overt, violent, racist rhetoric targeting a group of people who are our friends and neighbors, and who are our neighbors globally. 1 in 4 people on the planet, one of the Abrahamic religions, is being unleashed. So that's one crisis. I think that The issues about his isolationism are also obviously of concern. I do just want to say about that, though, that something that I really think has to stop, and Brexit is a reason it has to stop, and this election, is that elites like us here, we're talking about what America should do in the world as if half of America hasn't said they want a more isolationist position.
David K. Johnston has had to leave us. We're running out of time. Bob, there is this sense that Donald Trump, not just against Hillary Clinton, but against his fellow Republicans, against the Jeb Bushes and Marco Rubios of this world, he played off that sense of, yes, Americans want to focus on what's happening in America. They're less interested in the debacles abroad. Libya turned out to be a debacle. Iraq turned out to be a debacle. There's no clear choice in Syria. And that resonated with a lot of Americans, didn't it?
Yes,
Failed
it
foreign
did.
policies.
And it certainly did. And we saw it in the ballot boxes all around the country. I think it is certainly true that with a large group of Americans who feel that they have been left behind, they haven't been listened to, their jobs are in jeopardy, their wages are being pushed down or at least not increasing, and a whole other set of grievances as well. Unless we're able to deal with that, we're not going to be able to have a robust foreign policy because we won't have domestic support for it.
I mean, respectfully, you're really dismissing what a lot of these people are saying. They're saying 3,000 American young men and women are dead with a war that was based on lies to the American people. That
not dismissing it.
Wait, just wait, because they're talking about foreign policy. And 100,000 Iraqis are dead, and Boeing and Raytheon mint money from endless global war on terror that is never going to end. And people get that, and they're saying enough. We are not on board for that foreign policy. And that's not stupid, and I think that's something that, we all have to reckon with.
Donald Trump
I'm not dismissing it at all. I think Americans are concerned about just what you've said, wars in which people have lost lives, large numbers of lives, and of course,
not just wars, bad wars, wars of choice based on lies.
Okay, let Bob respond. Let Bob respond as we're nearly out of time.
I take your point that Americans most Americans feel that those wars have cost a lot of lives and a lot of money and are much more reluctant to get involved in international activities of a military nature anywhere in the world.
Okay.
I take that point totally.
That was a discussion on the show from back in November. But this weekend marks not just the arrival in the Oval Office of Donald Trump, but the departure from that office of Barack Obama. What legacy does he leave on the international stage? I spoke to Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor of The Nation magazine, and began by asking her how she would remember the impact of Barack Obama on the global stage.
More continuity than change in many regards. I do think the Iran nuclear deal was a major diplomatic gambit. It needs to be expanded. I think the opening toward Cuba, normalization with Cuba, was vital, but one could argue 49 years too late. I believe President Obama will leave us with a deepening, dangerous Cold War and an escalating arms race. These are an arms race which he, in 2009, spoke of a world without nuclear weapons, yet he leaves us with this $1 trillion modernization of nukes. He did expand the war on terror, though he didn't call it the global war on terror. He expanded the national security executive prerogatives so that, curiously, Mehdi, I think he has desensitized millions of Americans to war because we're not occupying and invading, though we have 100 special operations around the globe. So in the end, I would say more continuity than change, and that this country desperately needs a different foreign policy, one in which the United States isn't the policeman of the world, one that doesn't make regime change an American foreign policy.
Is that because he was firefighting for a lot of his presidency and he lacked a vision of his own, a distinct Obama foreign policy doctrine? His aides once claimed that his foreign policy amounted to don't do stupid stuff. Is that enough for a president to have as a foreign policy guiding vision?
I don't think presidents need hubristic foreign policy doctrines. I do think don't do stupid stuff is not a bad one at this time, but unfortunately I think the United States continues to do stupid stuff. For example, exacerbating a more militarized relationship with China, making trade, these corporate-led trade policies, a major legacy of Obama's administration. And I come back to positioning NATO and U.S. forces on Russia's border, continuing with this kind of underground NATO expansion, and the nuclear arms race, very, very dangerous and not going to contribute to not doing stupid stuff.
Why do you think someone as smart as him, as well-read as him, as someone who came into office with such kind of grandiose promises and expectations, had seen the failures of George W. Bush before him? Why do you think he ended up doing stupid stuff? Is it something in him that's in his character or personality or ideology, or is it simply the situation he found himself in, that he got carried away by events?
I think he came in not fully he didn't have a foreign policy vision. He was new. He did get elected largely because he opposed the Iraq War. He didn't oppose all wars. He opposed the Iraq War, stupid wars. But I think he also came into a situation where there is a deep state in this country. There is a national security apparatus which is metastasized after 9/11. And as I said, the president rightly put aside the global war on terror, this idea, this neocon idea that you could occupy countries and spread democracy in that way. President Obama promised to heal the breach with the Arab world, to open a new chapter. But I think he got caught up in an apparatus which was not open to that new chapter. He vowed to turn back much of George W. Yet in the end, only in the last few years did he begin to push Cuba, Iran.
And on those, on Iran and Cuba, do you think those last few years, these last few major developments that he pulled off, do you think they will outweigh the rest? The drone strikes, the war in Libya, the escalation in Afghanistan, the re-entry into Iraq, the big military aid package to Israel. A lot of people will say, well, no, one outweighs the other. Some Obama defenders might say it's unfair that his achievements, Iran, Cuba, the Paris climate change, are forgotten by the left.
Well, thank you for bringing up the Paris climate change, because I do think President Obama elevated, even though, always more needs to be done, especially in the area of climate change, but he did elevate that and moved it. Without his pressure, it wouldn't have moved. I think it's too early to tell, Mehdi. I think Iran, if the nuclear deal did move forward in a positive way, it would change the dynamics politically in the region. My hope was always it would open an era of détente, not just close down a nuclear program. But I think the president has passed on the baton of drone strikes, of special ops, of dangerous elements of U.S. foreign policy to a dangerous next president. And that has always been the problem. That's why a lot of progressives called on President Obama to not relitigate the past, but to hold accountable elements of the George W. Bush administration, which unfortunately have to a certain extent continued.
A lot of people will look at the hundreds of thousands of dead in Syria, all of which occurred on Obama's watch as president since 2011. And they will say that a lot of that blood is on his hand. He could have stopped it militarily, but chose not to. Many say his inaction on Syria has been as catastrophic as Bush's action on Iraq.
I don't think he could have stopped it militarily, Mehdi. I mean, I think there were various UN-brokered efforts to bring a political resolution to the Syrian crisis. And I think that regime change is also at the heart of the horror in Syria. There should have been some brokered deal where Assad stayed in power but then was moved out, and that millions of lives might have been saved. And I think one of Obama's accomplishments, and it was largely driven out of the UK when the parliament refused to authorize military action in Syria, was the diplomatic arrangement to dismantle chemical weapons via the agency involved with that, and not through military weapons. I think this country is still on a militarized footing in fighting terror, in dealing with other countries, when we are not going to resolve the refugee crisis, we're not going to resolve climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, the challenges of the 21st century in that 20th century mindset.
So just to be clear, you don't share the view of many critics of Obama, both on the liberal left and on the right, that Syria is a major stain on his record?
I do not. I do not. I think that it's a stain on the record of many of the war party, as I call them in Washington, which continued to arm Syrian moderate, if they're moderate rebels. I think it's very murky, the arena, and I think there should have been a humanitarian the focus should have been on doubling down, tripling down on humanitarian efforts to resolve the crisis. I think the wisest person in this country on it is the ex-president Jimmy Carter. I suggest to your viewers to review his 2 op-eds he's done. And I think he's someone who understood the importance of brokering a political deal that would have saved millions of lives, and not to continue pouring weapons into the region, arming rebels, and making it a war zone. What Russia and Syria have done is a war crime. And what we contributed to is also arming those who did not have civilians' interest at their heart. So I think what we need to do now is, you know, it's intractable as these problems become, but I think pouring more weapons, more military effort is not the way to go.
Katrina vanden Heuvel, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.